I always thought there was a specific sound a life makes when it shatters, a loud, definitive crack that lets you know everything you built is suddenly gone. But looking back on that rainy Tuesday night in October, I realized the worst kind of destruction happens in complete silence. It sneaks up on you in the quiet space between a heartbeat and a breath, in the soft glow of a dashboard light, shifting your entire reality so seamlessly that you don't even realize you're standing in the ruins of your own life until it's already too late. My name is David. For 7 years, I was married to Sarah, and if you had asked anyone in our quiet, tree-lined neighborhood just outside of Charlotte, North Carolina, they would have told you we were the golden couple. We had the classic American dream dialed in: a beautiful 4-bedroom colonial house with a wraparound porch, 2 dogs that chase squirrels in the fenced backyard, and a marriage that felt as solid as the foundation beneath our feet. Sarah was an interior designer with a laugh that could clear the clouds out of any room, and I was the co-founder of a boutique commercial real estate firm that had finally started hitting its stride after years of grinding through 80-hour work weeks. I trusted Sarah completely. It wasn't the kind of trust you have to remind yourself to maintain. It was like gravity. It was just there, a fundamental law of my universe. She was my anchor, the one person who knew every flaw, every ambition, and every quiet fear I ever harbored. Then there was Julian. Julian wasn't just my business partner. He was the guy who had stood right next to me as my best man when Sarah and I exchanged our vows under the sprawling oak trees at our wedding. We had met back in college at UNC, bonded over cheap beer and late-night study sessions, and eventually risked everything to start our firm. Julian was charismatic, sharp, and possessed a smooth, effortless confidence that made him an incredible frontman for our company. While I handled the numbers, the contracts, and the heavy operational lifting behind the scenes, Julian was the one shaking hands, closing deals at high-end steakhouses, and charming potential investors. We were a perfect team, both in the office and in life. Our families were intertwined. Julian dined at our house at least twice a month, sitting at our dining room table, drinking my whiskey, and laughing at Sarah's jokes like he was a permanent fixture in our lives. If you had told me back then that the 2 people I loved and trusted most in this world were capable of tearing my soul apart, I would have laughed in your face. The trouble started, or rather, the truth started leaking out, on a standard, exhausting Tuesday. We had been chasing a massive account for months, a multi-million-dollar commercial development project in downtown Charlotte that could elevate our firm into an entirely new league. The final pitch meeting had run incredibly late, stretching far past our usual office hours and bleeding into an intense 3-hour celebratory dinner at an upscale steakhouse downtown after the clients finally signed the contract. By the time we walked out of the restaurant, the rain was coming down in sheets, blurring the city lights into smudged streaks of neon red and yellow against the wet asphalt. I reached into my pocket for my car keys, only to remember with a wave of exhaustion that my truck was sitting in a service bay at the dealership 5 miles away. The transmission had started slipping the previous evening, and Sarah had dropped me off at the office that morning in her SUV before heading out to meet a client of her own. I stood under the green canvas awning of the restaurant, loosening my silk tie, the cool October wind spraying a fine mist across my face. I pulled out my phone to call an Uber, but the screen showed a 25-minute wait time due to the sudden downpour and the post-dinner rush in the city center. Julian noticed me staring at my phone and clapped a heavy, familiar hand onto my shoulder. His expensive watch caught the glow of the street lamp, gleaming through the dark rain. He told me to forget about waiting for a rideshare, saying he was heading right past my exit on the interstate anyway, and it would be ridiculous for me to sit on the curb in a wetsuit when his car was parked right around the corner in the parking garage. I hesitated for a fraction of a second, not wanting to burden him after such a long, grueling day, but the thought of a warm leather seat and a quick ride home went over my pride. I thanked him, told him he was a lifesaver, and we walked through the pouring rain to his brand new, top-of-the-line Audi sedan. The interior of Julian's car always smelled the same: expensive leather, high-end cologne, and success. As he pulled out of the garage and onto the slick, shimmering city streets, the windshield wipers swung in a rhythmic, hypnotic cadence. The atmosphere inside the cabin was warm and quiet, a stark contrast to the chaotic storm raging just beyond the glass. We started talking about the deal we had just closed, replaying the exact moment the client nodded their approval, basking in the shared adrenaline of a massive professional victory. Julian was driving with one hand on the steering wheel, his usual relaxed, unflappable self, while I leaned my head back against the headrest, feeling the deep, bone-weary fatigue of the long week finally catching up to me. About 10 minutes into the drive, as the city skyline began to recede in the rearview mirror and give way to the darker, wider stretches of the suburban interstate, Julian's phone buzzed. It was sitting in the center console storage tray, right below the massive, high-definition infotainment screen that dominated the dashboard. Because his phone was automatically connected to the car's system via Bluetooth, the notification didn't just stay on his screen. It flashed prominently across the dashboard display, casting a sharp blue glow into the dim interior of the car. I wasn't trying to spy. It was just a natural human reflex. When a bright screen flashes directly in your field of vision in a dark car, your eyes go to it. The notification showed an incoming text message. The contact name saved in Julian's phone wasn't a name at all. It was just an emoji, a small, simple red heart. But it wasn't the contact name that made my heart stop in my chest. It was the preview of the text message itself that read clearly across the screen. "I miss you so much. He just called and said the dinner is running late, so we have more time. Come back over. The back door is unlocked." I sat perfectly still, my eyes locked onto those words as they hovered on the dashboard screen for a few agonizing seconds before fading away. A strange, icy coldness began to spread from the center of my chest, radiating outward into my fingertips. The phrasing was oddly specific. The timing was terrifyingly precise. My mind, desperate to protect itself, immediately went into overdrive, trying to construct a logical explanation. Julian was a handsome, wealthy bachelor. He dated plenty of women. It could be anyone. It could be some girl he was seeing casually who happened to be waiting for her own boyfriend or husband to come home. It was a big city. Infidelity happened every day to other people, but not to me, not in my world. I forced myself to take a deep, quiet breath, keeping my eyes fixed straight ahead on the red taillights of the car in front of us. I didn't want Julian to see the sudden panic that I knew was written all over my face. I tried to swallow the lump forming in my throat, telling myself I was being paranoid, that the exhausting day was playing tricks on my mind. But then, my gaze drifted down to the passenger side door pocket right next to my left knee. Tucked neatly into the small plastic storage compartment of the door, partially hidden beneath a crumpled receipt, was a small, glittering object. I reached down slowly, my hand trembling slightly, and pulled it out into the faint ambient light of the cabin. It was a custom-made, gold-plated lipstick tube. The cap was engraved with a delicate, scrolling monogram of the initials SMA. Sarah Marie Albright. My wife. I stared at the heavy gold tube resting in my palm, the metal feeling like a block of solid ice against my skin. I knew this exact lipstick. I had bought it for her ourselves, just 3 months ago, for our wedding anniversary, from a luxury boutique she loved downtown. She had cried when she opened it, telling me it was too expensive, that I shouldn't have spent the money. She carried it everywhere. She called it her lucky charm. The cabin of the Audi suddenly felt completely devoid of oxygen. The rhythmic slap of the windshield wipers sounded like a deafening metronome, ticking down the final seconds of my life as I knew it. The warm air blowing from the vents felt suffocating, choking the breath right out of my lungs. I looked over at Julian, my partner, my best friend, the man who had toasted to my marriage and promised to always have my back. He was completely oblivious, humming softly to a song playing faintly on the radio, tapping his fingers against the leather-wrapped steering wheel as he navigated the dark, rain-soaked highway toward my home. Every single interaction over the past year began to flash through my mind in a horrific high-speed montage. The late-night business meetings Julian insisted Sarah help design the layouts for. The sudden, uncharacteristic interest Sarah had taken in our firm's local real estate developments. The times I would come home to find Julian already there, sitting on our couch, with Sarah pouring him a glass of wine while they laughed about something that immediately silenced the moment I walked through the door. I had always thought it was beautiful how well my best friend and my wife got along. I had felt proud of the tight-knit family we had built together. A wave of intense, violent nausea washed over me, so strong that I had to roll the window down an inch, letting the cold, biting rain spray across my face to keep from throwing up right there on the leather seats. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place with a brutal, merciless speed, forming a picture so grotesque that my brain actively screamed in denial, begging for any alternative reality where this was a mistake. But the cold gold metal of the lipstick tube, pressed firmly into the meat of my palm, was an unassailable, agonizing truth. "Hey man, you all right?" Julian's voice suddenly broke through the silence, sounding incredibly distant, as if he were speaking to me from the bottom of a deep, dark well. "You look like you've seen a ghost. That dinner really took it out of you, huh?" I slowly closed my fist around the lipstick tube, hiding it from his view, and shoved my hand deep into the pocket of my coat. I didn't look at him. I couldn't look at him. I knew that if I turned my head and looked at his face, the sheer, blinding rage boiling just beneath my skin would erupt, and I didn't know what I would do. I had to play it cool. I had to survive the rest of the strive. "Yeah," I choked out, my voice sounding tight, raspy, and completely foreign to my own ears. "Just a killer headache."
"Think the pressure from the storm is getting to me." "I hear that," Julian said smoothly, completely buying the lie as he flipped on his turn signal, slowing the car down as we approached the familiar exit ramp that led into my neighborhood. "Just a few more minutes, and you can crawl into bed. Sarah's probably already asleep anyway." The mention of her name coming out of his mouth felt like a physical blow to my jaw. It took every ounce of strength, every shred of discipline I possessed as a grown man to keep from reaching over and wrapping my hands around his throat. Instead, I gripped the fabric inside my pocket so tightly that my fingernails dug deep into my palms, drawing blood. The car glided off the interstate and entered the quiet, dark streets of my suburban neighborhood, passing the familiar houses of my neighbors, all dark and peaceful, completely unaware of the absolute horror show that was about to unfold inside my home. As Julian steered the Audi down my street, my eyes locked onto our house at the end of the cul-de-sac. The exterior lights were on, casting a warm, welcoming glow over the front porch. But as we drew closer, I noticed something that made the icy blood in my veins turn to pure fire. The light in our master bedroom upstairs was off, but the dim, flickering blue light of the television in the living room downstairs was visible through the sheer curtains. And there, parked neatly in the driveway, was Sarah's SUV. Julian pulled the car to a smooth stop at the edge of my driveway, leaving the engine idling with a low, expensive purr. He turned to me, a warm, genuine smile on his face, completely unaware that the mask had already fallen off. "Get some sleep, buddy," Julian said, reaching out to give my shoulder another friendly pat. "We completely crushed it today. Big things are coming for us." I looked at his hand on my shoulder, then finally looked him dead in the eyes. The dark, cold emptiness inside me must have shelled through, because his smile faltered for a fraction of a second, a flicker of confusion crossing his handsome features. "Yeah," I whispered, my hand still gripping the stolen lipstick inside my pocket. "Big things." I opened the passenger door, stepped out into the pouring rain, and closed the door firmly behind me. I didn't look back as the Audi backed out of the driveway and disappeared into the dark, rainy night. I stood there on the wet asphalt, the rain soaking through my expensive suit jacket within seconds, staring at the front door of my home. My hands were shaking violently as I reached into my pocket, pulled out my house keys, and walked slowly up the porch steps, knowing that the moment I opened that door, my entire life would change forever. I stepped into the foyer, closing the door behind me with agonizing slowness, trying to control the trembling in my hands. The house smelled like cinnamon and expensive vanilla candles, Sarah's signature scent, the smell I had associated with comfort and safety for nearly a decade. Now, it made my throat tighten with a bitter, suffocating heat. I stood on the hardwood floor of the entryway, the rain dripping from the hem of my wool coat and pooling around my dress shoes. The house was dead quiet, save for the low, muffled drone of the television coming from the living room around the corner. I didn't call out her name. I couldn't. I felt like a ghost haunting the perimeter of my own life, looking at the framed photos on the hallway wall.
Our trip to Maui, our first anniversary in Savannah, Sarah laughing as I carried her across the threshold of this very house. Every single picture felt like a meticulously crafted lie, a prop in a play I didn't know I was starring in. I walked toward the living room, my steps completely silent on the thick area rug. As I rounded the corner, the blue light of the television screen illuminated the room. Sarah was sitting on the center of our plush sectional couch, wrapped in a cream-colored knit blanket. Her laptop was open on her coffee table, surrounded by fabric swatches and design catalogs, creating the perfect alibi of a dedicated entrepreneur working late into the night. When she saw me standing there, soaked to the bone and pale as a sheet, she flinched slightly. It was a tiny, almost imperceptible movement, but I caught it. It was the reaction of someone who had just been jolted out of a state of high alert. Within a fraction of a second, the shock vanished, replaced by her familiar, warm smile. "Hey, sweetie," she said, her voice smooth, light, and completely natural, as she tossed the blanket aside and stood up. "You're freezing. I thought you said the dinner was going to run until midnight. I was just trying to finish up these mood boards for the Lake Norman client." She walked toward me, her arms opening for a hug, her eyes filled with what looked like genuine concern. It was a masterclass in performance. Watching her move toward me, completely unburdened by guilt, made a cold, hard knot of fury lock down in my stomach. I stepped back, just enough to avoid her touch, and began unbuttoning my wet coat. "The clients wanted to wrap up early," I said, my voice flat, devoid of the warmth I usually brought home. "And the rain got bad. Julian gave me a ride." I watched her face closely as I said his name. For a microsecond, the color drained from her lips, and her eyes darted toward the front window before snapping back to mine. She covered it beautifully, crossing her arms and shaking her head with a soft laugh. "Oh, thank goodness for Julian," she said, turning back toward the kitchen. "I was worried about you driving that truck in this weather. Let me get you a dry towel and make you some tea. You look absolutely exhausted, Dave." "Sarah." The sharpness in my tone stopped her dead in her tracks. She turned around slowly, her hands resting on the kitchen island, her brow furrowing into a look of innocent confusion. "Yeah? What's wrong?" I walked over to the kitchen island, the distance between us feeling like an ocean. I reached into my coat pocket, my fingers wrapping around the gold-plated cylinder. I pulled my hand out and placed the custom-engraved lipstick tube directly on the white quartz countertop between us. It rolled a few inches before hitting her laptop with a soft metallic click. The monogrammed SMA stared right up at her under the bright LED kitchen lights. "You dropped this," I said quietly. Sarah stared down at the lipstick. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating, and absolute. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the dining room seemed to amplify, filling the space between us. I watched the realization hit her. First came the confusion, then the sudden, rigid paralysis of her shoulders, and finally, the sheer, unadulterated terror that crept into her eyes. The mask didn't just slip, it completely shattered. Where did you find that?" she whispered, her voice losing all of its smooth, melodic rhythm. She didn't touch it. She looked at it like it was a live grenade.
"In Julian's car," I said, leaning forward slightly, my hands gripping the edge of the countertop so tightly my knuckles turned white. "In the passenger side door pocket, right after he got a text message from a contact saved as a red heart. A text that said the back door was unlocked and that her husband was running late." Sarah took a step back, her hands flying to her mouth. "David, no, it's not what you think. Please, just let me explain." "Explain what, Sarah?" The anger finally broke through my voice, low and vicious, a controlled burn that threatened to ignite the entire room. "Explain how my best man, my business partner, is screwing my wife in my own house while I'm out making the money that pays for this entire lifestyle. Explain how long you've been laughing at me behind my back. How many times has he been in our bed, Sarah? How many times?" "It was a mistake," she sobbed, the tears instantly welling up and spilling over her cheeks, ruining the perfect makeup she had put on for him. She reached out across the island, trying to grab my hands, but I pulled them back out of her reach.
I swear to you, it just happened. It's only been a couple of weeks. We got carried away. The stress of the business. We were spending so much time together working on the new office design. David, please, I love you. I love you so much. It didn't mean anything to him. It didn't mean anything to me.
Hearing her say it didn't mean anything made me want to rip the walls down. The casual dismissal of my entire universe, of 7 years of marriage, of a brotherhood I would have died for, reduced to a mistake caused by stress. "Don't lie to me," I roared, the sound tearing from my throat and echoing through the empty house. "Don't you dare stand there and insult my intelligence after what you've done. A couple of weeks? You think I'm blind? I've seen the way you two look at each other. I've seen the texts you delete. I trusted you with my life, Sarah. I built this entire world for us, and you handed the keys to the one guy who was supposed to protect my back if I ever fell down." She collapsed against the kitchen cabinets, sliding down slightly as she wept, her face buried in her hands. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, David. Please don't do this. We can fix this. We can go to counseling. I'll never see him again. I'll block his number. We can sell the house. We can move away." I looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time in my life, she looked like a complete stranger. The woman I loved was gone, replaced by a desperate, caught liar trying to negotiate her way out of the consequences of her own choices. The betrayal wasn't just a physical act. It was a total demolition of my past, my present, and my future. Every memory we shared was now poisoned. My phone suddenly buzzed in my pocket. The vibration felt like an electric shock against my thigh. I pulled it out, my eyes blurring with a mix of rain and unshed tears. The screen lit up with a text message from Julian. "Hey man, left my favorite pen in your truck yesterday, but remembered your truck is at the shop. Did I drop it in your house last week? Let me know. Need it for the closing tomorrow. Good night, brother." Brother. I stared at the screen, a terrifying, icy calm suddenly washing over the raging fire in my chest. The anger didn't disappear. It just crystallized into something hard, sharp, and lethal. They thought they were smarter than me. They thought they could play their games, ruin my life, and I would just be the oblivious, hard-working husband who kept the lights on. They had no idea who they were dealing with when everything was taken away. I looked up from the phone, staring at my weeping wife on the kitchen floor. I didn't feel pity anymore. I didn't even feel the urge to scream. "Get up," I said, my voice dropping into a dangerously quiet, freezing register. Sarah looked up through her tear-stained hair, a flicker of hope in her eyes, thinking maybe the storm had passed. "David, pack a bag," I said, turning my back on her and walking towards the stairs. "You're leaving. Tonight." Sarah scrambled up from the floor, her slippers squeaking against the hardwood as she rushed after me, catching the sleeve of my damp jacket at the foot of the stairs. "David, please, it's pouring outside. Where am I supposed to go?" "Just let me sleep in the guest room today. We can talk about this in the morning when we're both calm. Please, don't throw me out like this." I didn't turn around. I just looked down at her hand clutching my arm, the gold wedding band on her finger catching the light of the hallway chandelier. The sight of it felt like a physical burn. I peeled her fingers off my sleeve one by one, my grip firm but entirely devoid of emotion. "Call Julian," I said, my voice echoing off the high ceiling of the foyer, flat and freezing. "Ensure the back door is still unlocked. Go sleep in his bed. You've clearly been practicing for it." She flinched as if I'd struck her, her mouth falling open in a silent, gasping sob. The sheer weight of her reality was finally crushing her. There was no talking her way out of this. No sweet-talking the husband who had spent 7 years putting her on a pedestal. I turned and walked up the stairs, each step heavy, leaving her standing alone in the dark entryway. Upstairs, the master bedroom felt like a crime scene. The bed was neatly made, the pillows fluffed, a book she had been waiting resting on her nightstand. I walked over to her closet, yanked open the double doors, and pulled out a large black leather duffel bag she used for weekend trips. I threw it onto the bed and began grabbing clothes at random from her hangers. Dresses, blouses, jeans, shoving them into the bag with zero regard for how they folded or wrinkled. She stood in the doorway, watching me tear down the life we had spent nearly a decade building, her hands clamped over her mouth to muffle her crying. I grabbed her makeup bag from the bathroom, her toothbrush, a handful of shoes from the floor,
and rammed them into the duffel. I zipped it shut with a violent, definitive jerk that sounded like a final breath escaping the room. I walked past her, throwing the heavy bag at her feet in the hallway. "Take your car keys and go. If you're still here in 10 minutes, I'm putting everything you own onto the front lawn in the mud." "You're destroying us, David," she choked out, her voice cracking with a desperate, pathetic attempt to shift the blame. "People make mistakes. We promised forever." "You destroyed us when you let him into this house, Sarah," I said, looking her dead in the eyes, completely unmoved by her tears. "You don't get to invoke a vow you spat on. Get out." Realizing she had completely lost her grip on me, she picked up the heavy bag, her shoulders slumping into total defeat. I watched her walk down the stairs, heard the front door open, and then the heavy click of the latch closing behind her. A minute later, the low rumble of her SUV engine started up in the driveway, followed by the sound of tires splashing through the puddles as she backed out onto the street and drove away. Then, there was only the silence. I sank down onto the edge of our bed, burying my face in my hands. The adrenaline that had kept me upright for the last hour suddenly evaporated, leaving a hollow, aching exhaustion that felt like it was breaking my ribs. I sat there in the quiet house for what felt like hours, listening to the rain beat against the window pane. My mind was spinning out of control, replaying every meeting, every lunch, every single project Julian and I had worked on over the past year. Every time he had smiled at me, clapped my back, and called me his brother, he was hiding the fact that he was systematically stealing the foundation of my life. But as the initial shock began to crystallize into a cold, calculating resolve, I realized something critical. Julian hadn't just stolen my wife. He was my business partner. Our entire livelihoods, our clients, our millions of dollars in commercial real estate assets were completely intertwined. If I just went completely off the deep end, if I showed up at his office and threw a punch, I would lose everything. He would get the girl, he would get the firm, and I would be left with nothing but a mugshot and a ruined reputation. I stood up, walked into my home office down the hall, and flicked on the desk lamp. I sat down at my computer, the glow of the screen reflecting in the dark glass of the window. If Julian wanted to play a dirty, covert game behind my back, I was going to show him exactly what happens when the guy who manages the numbers decides to rewrite the rules. I opened our secure company portal and accessed the private financial servers. Because I handled all the heavy operational lifting and the legal structuring of our deals, I had master access to every single account, every LLC shell we used for property acquisitions, and every upcoming contract. Julian was the face of the company, but I was the engine. He didn't even know the passwords to half of our secondary escrow accounts. He trusted me implicitly with the money, just like I had trusted him with my life. I spent the next 4 hours pulling up bank statements, wire transfers, and corporate operating agreements, and that's when I found it. It was hidden deep within a secondary construction account we had set up for a luxury condominium development project in North Raleigh. Over the past 6 months, there had been a series of substantial, irregular wire transfers flowing out of that account into a private offshore LLC, registered in the Cayman Islands under the name S&J Holdings. S&J. Sarah and Julian. The coldness inside me solidified into pure stone. He wasn't just sleeping with my wife. They were planning an exit strategy. Julian had been systematically skimming off the top of our development funds, funneling cash into a private account, likely preparing to force me out of the firm or blindside me with a massive asset draining during a divorce. Sarah hadn't just made a mistake fueled by stress. She was actively helping him rob me blind. I sat back in my leather chair, staring at the digital paper trail illuminated on the screen. My heart was hammering against my ribs, but my hands were completely steady now. The grief was gone, entirely burned away by a cold, merciless desire for retribution. They thought they had backed me into a corner, completely oblivious to the fact that they had just given me the exact weapons I needed to completely destroy them both. I pulled out my phone, looking back at the casual text message Julian had sent me earlier about his lost pen. I tapped out a response, my fingers moving deliberately across the glass. "Hey man, just saw this. Didn't see a pen, but don't worry about it. We completely nailed that closing today. Let's meet at the downtown office tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. before the staff gets in to review the final execution documents for the Charlotte development. Huge day ahead. I hit send. A few seconds later, the 3 little dots appeared, and Julian replied, "Sounds good, brother. See you at 8. I closed the laptop, stood up, and looked out the window at the breaking dawn. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the streets wet and gleaming under the pale gray morning light. I had exactly 2 hours before I had to look my best friend in the eye and pretend that my world hadn't ended the night before. But as I walked downstairs to put on a fresh, dry suit, I didn't feel like a victim anymore. I felt like an executioner. The glass and steel skyscraper of our downtown Charlotte office building rose into the crisp morning air, reflecting the pale gold of the rising sun. I walked through the lobby, my polished dress shoes clicking rhythmically against the marble floor. I looked immaculate. My navy suit was perfectly pressed, my tie was straight, and my hair was neatly combed. To anyone passing by, I was a successful executive on his way to a massive financial victory. Inside, I was a block of solid ice. I took the private elevator to the top floor, stepping out into the quiet reception area of our firm. The receptionist wouldn't arrive for another hour. The long, carpeted hallway was dark, save for the single beam of light spilling out from the glass-walled conference room at the very end of the hall. Julian was already there. I walked slowly down the corridor, catching my reflection in the glass partitions. I took one deep, steadying breath, burying the rage so deep inside myself that it couldn't surface, and stepped into the room. Julian was sitting at the massive mahogany conference table, a steaming paper cup of coffee in front of him, skimming through a stack of legal documents. When he heard the door open, he looked up, his handsome face breaking into that same easy $1,000,000 smile that had charmed investors and blinded me for years. "There he is." Julian clapped his hands together, standing up to greet me. "The man of the hour."
Look at you, not even a trace of that headache from last night. Ready to secure the empire? He stepped toward me, extending his hand for our usual firm, brotherly handshake. I looked down at his open palm, the very hand that had held my wife, the hand that had signed the secret wire transfers to strip away my future. I didn't take it. Instead, I walked past him, tossing my leather briefcase onto the center of the table with a heavy, hollow thud. Julian's hand dropped slowly to his side, his smile faltering, his eyes narrowing slightly as he picked up on the sudden, freezing tension in the room. "Dave, everything good, man?" I opened my briefcase, pulled out a thick white folder, and slid it across the polished mahogany table. It slid smoothly, stopping right against his coffee cup. "Open it," I said, my voice completely level, lacking any hint of inflection. Julian looked at me, a flicker of nervous hesitation crossing his eyes, before he reached down and flipped the folder open. The first page was a high-resolution printout of the text message dashboard display from his Audi the night before, showing the red heart contact and the message about the unlocked back door. The next 50 pages were the complete, certified forensic accounting records of the construction escrow account, detailing every single illicit wire transfer to S&J Holdings in the Cayman Islands, complete with his digital signature routing numbers. As Julian flipped through the pages, the color drained from his face with terrifying speed. His skin turned a sickly, translucent gray, and beads of sweat instantly formed along his hairline. His hands began to shake so violently that the papers rattled against the wood. "David, this isn't," he stammered, swallowing hard, his smooth confidence completely evaporating into thin air. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with the panicked, wild look of an animal caught in a steel trap. "Dave, listen to me. It's not what it looks like. S&J Holdings, it was a temporary tax shelter, man. I was going to surprise you with the restructuring. And the text? It's a misunderstanding." "Sarah confessed, Julian," I said quietly, leaning against the back of an executive chair, crossing my arms. "She cried on the kitchen floor for an hour last night after I found her lucky monogrammed lipstick in your passenger side door pocket. I threw her out of the house. She's gone." The mention of her name and the realization that his alibi was utterly dead seemed to break him physically. Julian sank heavily back into his chair, his head dropping into his hands. "Oh my God," he breathed, staring at the table. "Dave, I'm so sorry. I swear to God I never wanted to hurt you. It just happened. We got trapped in the momentum of everything, and it spiraled out of control. Please, brother, we've been friends for 15 years. We built this company from nothing." Don't destroy everything over a mistake. I'm not destroying anything, Julian, I said, pulling a second, much thinner document from my briefcase and placing it directly over his stolen bank records. You did that all by yourself. That document right there is a full, legally binding corporate buyout and separation agreement. Julian blinked through his panic, looking down at the paper. A buyout? You are going to sign over every single share of this firm to me, I said, my voice dropping into a razor-sharp whisper that cut through the silence of the room. You are going to forfeit your equity, your client commissions, and your ownership rights to every property asset under our LLCs. Effective immediately, you own 0% of this company. You walk away with nothing. Julian gasped, his defensive instincts flaring up through his fear. Are you insane? That's millions of dollars. I built half of this business. I'm the face of this firm. You can't just strip me of my entire life's work because of a personal dispute. I'll fight you in court. The board will never approve this. You won't fight me in court, Julian, because you won't live long enough to see the trial outside of a federal penitentiary, I said, leaning forward across the table, getting so close I could see the panic vibrating in his pupils. If your signature isn't on that line by 8:15 a.m., the flash drive in my pocket goes directly to the United States Attorney's Office for the Western District of North Carolina. Embezzlement, corporate bank fraud, wire fraud, and grand larceny across state lines. With the amount of money you skimmed from that Raleigh project, you aren't looking at a country club prison. You're looking at 10 to 15 years in a federal cell. Your career is over, your reputation is ashes, and your wealth is gone. Julian stared at me, his jaw trembling. He looked at the document, then back at me, searching my face for any sign of the soft, trusting friend he had manipulated for years. But he found nothing but an empty, unforgiving void. He realized with absolute certainty that I would ruin him without a single shred of hesitation. With a trembling hand, Julian reached into his breast pocket and pulled out his pen. He didn't say another word. The silence in the room was deafening as he flipped to the signature page, pressed the pen to the paper, and scrawled his name on the line, forfeiting everything he had ever worked for. He pushed the paper back to me, his shoulders slumped, looking like a defeated, broken old man. "You're a monster, David," he whispered, his voice cracking. "No," I said, picking up the signed document and placing it neatly back into my briefcase. "I'm the guy who kept the numbers straight. You just forgot to check the math." I locked my briefcase with a sharp click, turned my back on my former best friend, and walked out of the conference room. I didn't look back as I left the floor, stepping into the elevator and descending back down to the city streets. 2 weeks later, the divorce papers were finalized. Because Sarah had signed an ironclad prenuptial agreement when we married, and because I possessed the proof of her active complicity in Julian's corporate fraud scheme, her high-priced attorney advised her to settle immediately. She walked away with nothing but the clothes I had shoved into that black leather duffel bag on the night of the storm. I still live in the beautiful 4-bedroom colonial house outside of Charlotte. Sometimes, in the quiet hours of the night when the rain beats against the windows, I sit in my home office and look out over the empty backyard. The house is entirely mine now. The firm is entirely mine now. I won the war. I took everything they had. And I left them with nothing but the wreckage of their own betrayal. But as I sit alone in the silence of my perfect, empty empire, I realize that the cost of total victory is that you have to become just as cold as the people who broke you.